Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to the third Richard Burton lecture. My name is Chris Williams, and I edited the Richard Burton Diaries, and I'm also the director of the Research Institute for Arts and Humanities, which has helped to organise and promote this event, along with the Richard Burton Centre for the Study of Wales, the Learned Society of Wales, and Literature Wales. The theme of this evening's lecture is Wales, America, and the space race. And before we begin the substantive part of the proceedings, it is perhaps worth reflecting on what Richard Burton himself thought of the project to put a man on the moon. He was well aware of this ambitious venture. He shows that in his diaries. He followed its progress in the press. He noted in October 1968 that the news of the return of Apollo 7, the first successful manned Apollo mission, was getting crowded out by the furore surrounding Jackie Kennedy's marriage to Aristotle Onassis. 2 months later, Apollo 8 was off to orbit the moon, and typically, Burton was interested in the health and the rather raw details of how humans functioned in space. 2 of the astronauts, he wrote, have flu. One of them is vomiting and has the Tripoli trots. What a lovely place to have the Aztec two-step. I've forgotten what they do with excrement in outer space. Can they jettison it? Well, I don't know the answer, but I'm sure we'll find out later this evening. And in July 1969, while staying at the Dorchester in London, Burton wrote that the whole world has gone mad, myself included, because, of course, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had landed on the moon. I've read more about the moon and watched on TV more about the moon than in the rest of my life put together. He writes about the incredible moments of tension as the lunar craft landed on the moon, then it blasting back off from the surface of the moon, and finally, of course, docking with the command module. Now all they have to do, he wrote, is get home. Well, this evening, we look to relive and gain fascinating insights into that and later space programmes by means of a conversation between Dr. Daniel Williams, the director of the Richard Burton Centre for the Study of Wales, and George Abbey, currently Fellow in Space Policy at the Baker Institute at Rice University in Houston, Texas, former director of the Johnson Space Center for NASA, and someone who, in his highly distinguished career, has stood at the epicenter of the Apollo program, the Space Shuttle Initiative, and the International Space Station. And we're delighted to have George here in Swansea, and we look forward enormously to hearing more about his career. Daniel and George's conversation will be followed by a vote of thanks given by the Right Honourable Rhodri Morgan, the Chancellor of Swansea University, who approximately 24 hours ago predicted with 99.9% confidence and with glorious accuracy that the Swansea University First 15 would go on to defeat their Cardiff University rivals in the varsity match. But first this evening, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Gwyneth Lewis, who is Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, former National Poet of Wales, a newly elected Fellow, I believe today, of the Learned Society of Wales, and the Royal Literary Fund Fellow here at Swansea. Gwyneth is one of the most distinguished of Welsh poets, indeed of poets currently writing in the English language as well. She has a global reputation on paper, on the airwaves, and of course in stone, stained glass and gypsum. Reflecting on Wales, America and the space race, Gwyneth is going to read from her 1998 collection, Zero Gravity. So please welcome Gwyneth Lewis.
Noswaith dda I chi gyd, good evening everybody, and thank you for the chance to share a platform with one of the greats of NASA, who I've heard a lot about. The reason is that my cousin became an astronaut and was selected by Mr. George Abbey, and he went to space with shingles, you know. He didn't tell you, I don't know if you knew, but because he didn't want to be taken off the flight. So I'm just going to read briefly, because I'm the warm-up act tonight. Not that you need any warming up at all, this audience or the following speakers. But I just wanted, I think I must, fair to say, I've been fairly obsessed with space since I was a child, because I remember the moon landings. And you couldn't have worried about what the surface of the moon was going to do to the foot of an astronaut without it changing your worldview forever. The Mabinogion, as you will know, are medieval Welsh myths, and I was given the chance to rewrite one, and I set it in outer space as a science fiction story. So I want to read just a tiny bit of that and then go on to poetry. There's been a shipwreck found on just outside Mars, and the ship inspector, the inspector of wrecks, which is a real job today, except not in outer space, is telling how they explore what happened on board this ship. I love the sounds of the ship at night, the reactor's hum and crackling of the hull as debris hits us, the click, click, click of equipment as it digests its interior measurements, adjusting to light, temperature and yaw. The fans on the hydroponics as the plants breathe and sigh to make us our oxygen. I know we're in orbit, but it doesn't take much to imagine that I'm on the night watch of a very long voyage. I feel protective of Nona as she sleeps. She's the heart of the vessel for me. What was it like for those people on a long-distant flight of years in a closed-loop system, so that nothing new could come out or go in of their vessel, so that they had to survive only on the resources they had? How would you keep the sense of a day just by counting the hours? Would you be able to sleep without the cues of light and sunset? Wouldn't your fellow crew members' habits become distinctly annoying? How one slurps his food, how the other farts. As you got further and further away from home, would the same things continue to be important to you? The chain of command, the original mission. Might you not start feeling ill if you imagined that the ship was toxic in some way? That pollutants had entered the system and were starting to kill you slowly? That the very air you breathed was compromised? And what about mutiny? Disputes on a spaceship can easily become a matter of life and death. Campion, you're daydreaming, get a grip, and so on. Having seen the space shuttle that they train on in NASA, I have no desire to go to space whatsoever. It's absolutely tiny, and worse than a wet weekend in a caravan in West Wales, I can tell you. I find I've written more often than I thought, as I say, about space. The most recent is part of a long poem called Hospital Odyssey, and it's a patient's journey and a carer's journey through a hospital. And I was looking for images of the body, and the breakdown of the space station Mir. I remember that vividly. You found that one thing had gone wrong and they'd fixed that or bodged a repair, and then something else terrible would go wrong. And it seemed a good image for a body breaking down. The story is that Hardy, who's the husband, is the one who's ill. He's having a stem cell transplant, and Maris, or the sea, is looking for him, and she finds him in outer space where he's undergoing this crisis. And I'm sure that the science in this is correct, by the way. I'm not nervous at all about the scientists who are here, because Sir Martin Evans and I had my personal astrophysicist to check this. So, but if you do find a mistake, do tell me, but I'm pretty confident. Maybe not then, but this is what Hardy saw from his dying. Maris bending over him, and behind her the vibrant, dazzling core of the sun, rich and red as hemochrome at 15 million degrees. He was overcome by the knowledge that everything out there was in truth his own body. We're filaments of light. We're talking with everywhere at once. We were never meant to be thought of as single, lines to be bent in the space-time continuum. That's prose. No, it's more like the drive of poetry. It's as when I rhyme, there's always a nanosecond before I've chosen a word, when I perceive all its homophones at once, before the end word's probability wave collapses, before I take a chance on one meaning, when my mind revolves with the quantum mechanics that make stars evolve from the tiniest jitters. We're born to catastrophe. Galaxies fly away from each other in identical forms. Matter never sees fit to die. And if life is the transfer of energy from one state to another, this poem from me to you, then this continual exchange must be our purpose. Infinity's birdsong continues just beyond the range of our human hearing. Love is the hinge on which it all turns. Chris mentioned Zero Gravity, which is a sequence I wrote after going to one of my cousin's launches. It's a pretty extravagant launch. Usually if you say a launch, it's a book launch or something, a slim volume of poetry, but this was mind-blowing, a truly sublime experience. It was awesome in the true sense of the word. At the same time as Joe was going for his first voyage, my sister-in-law was dying of cancer. Also, Hale Bopp had been here recently, the comet that appeared. I mean, I know we saw it very clearly in Swansea because I saw its double tail down in the Gower. So I put all three journeys together. I'll just read a few of these poems. Zero Gravity, a Space Requiem. Prologue. We watched you go in glory. Shuttle, comet, sister-in-law. The one came back. The other two went further. Love's an attack on time. The whole damn thing explodes, leaving us with our countdown days still more than zero. My theme is change. My point of view ecstatic. See how speed transforms us? Didn't you know that time's a fiction? Don't need it for travel. Distance is a matter of seeing. Faith, a science of feeling faint objects. Of course, this is no comfort as we watch you go on your dangerous journeys. This out of mind hurts badly when you're left behind. Don't leave us. We have more to say before the darkness. Don't go. Stay a little longer. But you're out of reach already. Above us the sky sees with its trillion eyes. First time I saw the comet, I finally knew that I'd always love him. I watched it go, dead starlight headed for a dying sun, then away into darkness. It was gone before we knew what its brilliance meant. A human moment in immense spirals of nothing. I feel his pull in my blood salts. The comet's tail is a searchlight from another point. And the point is, once you've given your heart, there are no replacements. Oh, your soul, if that can escape from its own black hole. Mr. Abbey will know that the last night before flying is called the Last Supper, isn't it? And this is an account of Joe's Last Suppers. Seeing photographs of it. Last suppers, I fancy, are always widescreen. I see this one in snapshot. Your brothers are rhymes with you and each other. John has a shiner from surfing. Already we're counting time backwards to zero. The shuttle processed out like an idol to its pagan pad. It stands by its scaffold, being tended and blessed by priestly technicians. You refuse to feel sad, can't wait for your coming wedding with speed out into weightlessness. We watch you dress in your orange spacesuit, a Hindu bride with wires like henna for your loveliness. You carry your helmet like a severed head. We think of you as already dead. And this is after Jacqueline had died. What is her vanishing point? Now that she's dead but still close by, we assume she's heard our conversations. Out of sight? Out of mind? On her inward journey, she's travelled beyond the weight of remembering. The G-force lifts from her labouring chest. Forgetting's a gift of lightness. She's sped vast distances already. She's shed her many bodies: cancer, hope, regard, marriage, forgiving. Get rid of time, and everything's dancing. Forget straight lines. All's blown away. Now's honey from the bees of night, music from the bees of day. Thank you very much.
Wel, diolch yn fawr, Gwyneth, bendigedig. Little did you know, George, in selecting Joe Tanner to be a shuttle astronaut, he was simultaneously laying the groundwork for one of the most striking sequences of poetry that we've witnessed in Welsh literature lately. It's been great hearing Gwyneth read her work in your presence, and to have played a minor part in bringing that about. I couldn't have done that without the help of several people, so I just mention them. The Learned Society of Wales sponsored the reception tonight outside, and Literature Wales sponsored Gwyneth's reading. And many people across the campus, I can't mention them all, have helped in various ways with tonight's event, but I particularly acknowledge the help of Helen Baldwin and Elaine Canning in RIAH, and Liz Schweib over in the university's marketing department. And there are lots of other people, so diolch I chi gyd. Mae nawr, wrth gwrs, yn anrhydedd arbennig I fi gael cyflwyno a George Abbey I chi, a'i groesawu i'r llwyfan. It's of course a great privilege for me now to welcome George Abbey formally and invite him to join us. Chris filled us in on some of George's career, and that's what we'll be exploring in the interview to follow. So I won't list George's mammoth list of achievements. Suffice to note here, perhaps, that according to the Smithsonian Air and Space magazine, George Abbey, I quote, has had more influence on human spaceflight than almost anyone in history. And it's a real honour to have him here with us tonight. What I'll try and do, very briefly, as an introduction, however, is indicate why a cultural critic, such as myself, working in this university's historic and vibrant English department, would wish to bring George Abbey back to Swansea to deliver this year's Richard Burton Centre lecture, and to map very broadly the cultural context in which we might locate this evening's event. I'll begin by asking you to picture a scene. George Abbey Sr. is in mission control, Houston, as Neil Armstrong prepares to land on the moon. It's the 20th of July, 1969, and as Armstrong approaches to several hundred feet above the surface, he's under automatic computer control. He looks out of the window of the lunar module spacecraft through a graphical grid that frames his view. The computer in his cabin has calculated where the spacecraft will eventually land, directing Armstrong's gaze through the grid towards that point. But the smooth flow of the landing is interrupted by computer program alarms, and the lunar module is off target. Armstrong turns off the computer's automatic targeting, grasps the control sticks and lands the machine by eye and hand. The landing is hailed as a triumph of technology. But reporters also note that the landing is a victory for human judgment and intuition over cold, calculated automation. In 1977, 5 years after the Apollo program, in which George Abbey played a central role, had ended, a similar moment was reenacted in what is perhaps the most widely consumed representation of space, Star Wars. As the hero Luke Skywalker pilots his X-Wing fighter in a daring raid on the Death Star, he peers through a computer-generated grid that displays calculations of where his missiles, when fired, will eventually hit. Having missed a few times, Skywalker approaches the critical firing point in the final bombing run and turns off the computer display. He trusts instead his own intuition and feeling, aided by that metaphysical force. He fires his shot without the computer and succeeds in destroying the enemy and saves civilization. Both of these dramas elevate human skill and intuition above artificial mechanisms. This theme is not, of course, a new one. As the great Welsh critic Raymond Williams noted in his seminal The Country and the City, an emphasis on the human soul, on emotion, on nature, and on the primitive was a characteristic response to industrialism and mechanization. Indeed, it was this response to what was perceived to be an increasingly regimented industrial world that partly explains the remarkable success of Dylan Thomas's ultimately tragic trips to the United States. Writing in what Robert Lowell called the tranquilized consumerist 50s, the American poet Carl Shapiro responded to Dylan Thomas's death in New York by noting that the animal is everything in Thomas. We listen because he calls it animal. And there are suggestions of druidism in his work and primitive fertility rites, apparently still extant in Wales. He'd heard of Alltwen, obviously. All this made Thomas, according to Shapiro, outside the orbit of the English poets, a description that George Abbey, another American admirer of Dylan Thomas's work, took literally in arranging for the Welshman's poems to be taken into space. That Thomas's works should be taken to space is appropriate, because the relationship between the mechanical and the human, the primitive and the technological, is written into the very language of his verse. Take the force that through the green fuse, for example. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age, that blasts the roots of trees is my destroyer. The force that drives through the fuse to blast and destroy is juxtaposed to the flower, to the roots of trees, and the dominant greenness. The poem sustains this taut relationship in its exploration of birth and death, construction and destruction, rendering the poet dumb at the end of every stanza. In the conclusion to the penultimate stanza, Thomas tells us, in lines that I think are very appropriate for tonight, that I am dumb to tell a weather's wind how time has ticked a heaven round the stars. The drafts for this poem, held with so much of Thomas's work at the Harry Ransom Centre in Texas, another link, tells us that he had trouble with these last lines. He couldn't get the rhythm to work. And I am dumb to tell how time is all seemed to be the final version. But below these lines is a startling notation. Dylan writes out the Welsh word for time, amser. He then divides it into am and ser. Am is then translated to round, ser to stars. It gives him his last line, how time has ticked a heaven round the stars. This is false etymology, but an inspired kind of bilingual punning, and a striking example of Thomas using his parents' language, Welsh, to create a line of English poetry. It's an example of the way in which the Welsh language functions as what my colleague Wyn Thomas has described, the black hole within Welsh English language literature. It's that which you cannot see, but it's there, affecting the shape of everything around it. A notion that's also perhaps relevant to thinking of the voice and career of Richard Burton, to whom this series of lectures is dedicated and endowed by Burton's wife, Sally. I hope in the next 40 minutes or so you'll hear a lot more from George Abbey than from me, but in asking my questions I'll try and follow the trajectory of this introduction. We'll start in space, allowing George to share some of the remarkable experiences that he has had during his career, and hopefully we'll then track our way around the stars to his upbringing in Seattle, and via his Welsh-speaking mother, we'll come back to Larne. Let me now call on our esteemed guest to the stage, Mr. George W.S. Abbey.
Thank you.
Right, it might take a minute just to get the balance right in terms of sound. Well, as Gwyneth was talking about Joe Tanner, George, let me ask a broad question to begin, and then we'll trace back. George confirmed to me yesterday that, of course, he selected Joe Tanner. And my question is, how do you select an astronaut? You know, how did George Tanner become an astronaut, and what was your role in that process, which presumably was a similar role in other cases?
Well, I chaired the astronaut selection board, so I was directly involved in selecting all the astronauts. And the astronaut job is a very unique job, very special job. It requires individuals that have an engineering or a science background. But when you fly, you're going to be doing experiments for others on the ground. So you have to have an interest in doing maybe more than just your specialty. Say you're a physicist, you need to be able to do life science experiments. So you have to have an interest of doing something besides your particular specialty or task. And also have some operational experience, because you're going to be operating in space, and having operational experience, and particularly experience under stress, is very important. And probably one of the more important factors is being able to function as a team member, because when you fly in space, you're not working as an individual. You're flying as a member of a team of a crew, and also a team on the ground. So you have to have an ability to fit in and work well as a team member. In the case of Joe had all those attributes and fitted in very well. So it was easy to select Joe Tanner. It's, I think, very fortunate that we've had really no trouble selecting people. We always had more than enough qualified people, and the astronauts that we did select have really turned out to be, all of them have turned in to be very good astronauts and do very well. And there's six astronauts and cosmonauts flying, even as we're meeting here today. Chris Hadfield, a Canadian astronaut, is the commander of the space station, and Chris fills all those bills as well. He has all the attributes Joe Tanner had, and has done very well.
Certainly puts reading UCAS forms in context, choosing astronauts. You were a pilot. Let's go back to the beginning then, your journey into NASA. You were a pilot in the US Air Force.
Yes.
This is presumably the late 50s, mid-50s?
Well, I went into the U.S. Air Force after I got out of the Naval Academy. The Naval Academy is a school that trains officers primarily to go into the Navy, but the Air Force Academy didn't have a university at that time, and so they took a certain percentage from West Point, the military academy, and the Naval Academy, and you had the option of going into the Air Force and becoming a pilot. I had the option of going into the Navy and becoming a pilot, but Navy said that before I could become a pilot, I'd have to go to sea on a ship for about 18 months or 2 years, and then I could go to flying training. So I chose to go into the Air Force and go right directly to flying school, and finished my flying training and got my wings, and then became an instructor in the training command, and and flew in the train command for a number of years, and then had an event that changed my life significantly. It was in October of 1947, October 4th, 1947. Remember it very well. And I had taken some leave from the base I was stationed at in Texas, and had gone back to visit my parents in Seattle, and had driven back with my family. And we were coming back through Montana in an October evening, and this satellite overflew us, and you could hear the beep beep of Sputnik as it overflew. And I stopped the car and got out and looked up in the sky and saw Sputnik, and decided I really wanted to be involved in the space program, and went into graduate school, started graduate school and got my graduate degree, and then went into research and development in the Air Force. And at that point in time, the Air Force was developing a spacecraft that had a lot of the characteristics of the space shuttle. It was a one-man glider, like the shuttle, only much smaller, and it was going to fly on a rocket booster. And I had the opportunity when I finished graduate school to get involved directly in that program. At the same time, the Mercury program was underway. And we were going to go ahead and fly that vehicle much like the X-15 first, dropping it from a B-52 and doing landings out at Edwards Air Force Base, and then eventually taking it to orbit. But just about the time we were ready to take it down and fly it on the B-52, the Secretary of Defense canceled the program. So I didn't get the opportunity to participate in that program through to its completion, and got involved. I was at that time I was stationed at Boeing because I'd gone out to work at the Boeing plant as an engineer responsible for the Dinosaur, and the Air Force had been asked to provide some officers with some experience to help on the Apollo program, because General Sam Phillips had been appointed the director of the Apollo program. He had a great career in the Air Force as a leader of our research and development programs. He had been the program manager for the B-52. That was a very successful program. It's still flying today. And the Minuteman rocket, the ICBM, and he had done well on both those programs. And he got appointed as director of Apollo and got assigned to NASA. And so he was looking for officers that wanted to go work on Apollo, and I was selected as one of the individuals that they interviewed, and was selected to go to Houston and got involved in the space program in Apollo.
Just a point of clarity there, George. You mentioned the Dinosaur program.
Yes.
D-Y-N-O.
D-I-N-A-S-O-A-R.
I'm just an English professor, I can't spell. But that was the military program, was it? And
Yes,
NASA
it was.
had a parallel program. So were they in competition with each other? Or?
Well, the Mercury program was going to fly at that time, and it was going to fly human space. The Air Force was going to fly the Dinosaur. They had participated both in the X-15 program, both NASA and the Air Force. So it wasn't really a competitor because it landed on a runway like the shuttle,
I see.
Where the Mercury program was really a ballistic shape, and came down in a parachute in the ocean. So it was not really a direct competitor, and the Dinosaur was really looking at more military applications.
Right. So you joined NASA. It's 1964. It's an exciting time. Kennedy's announced that within the next decade we're going to land on the moon. Is that right? Perhaps you could just talk us through that.
It's kind of an interesting story because back in April of 1961, April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to fly in space. The Russians launched Yuri Gagarin, and that, as Sputnik did, it surprised the Western world because we didn't think that they were quite at that point, but the Russians were. And the United States had a program to fly a human in space, the Mercury program, but it was only going to fly a suborbital flight, not an orbital flight, and that was not ready to fly when Yuri Gagarin flew. It flew on May 5th of 1961, about a month after Yuri Gagarin flew, but it only went about 350 miles downrange, didn't go into orbit. And that was May 5th of 1961. And on May 25th of 1961, President Kennedy, in front of a joint session of the Congress, announced that we were going to go to the moon and do that before the end of the decade and return men safely back to the Earth. At that point in time, we didn't know how we were going to do that. But he said that's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it by the end of the decade. That caused everyone, I think, a great shock at that point. And at that point, we had just flown Alan Shepard, and John Glenn hadn't even flown in orbit. He didn't fly until February of 1962. And so when really President Kennedy made that announcement in 61, less than 7 years later, we were orbiting the moon on Apollo 8. So, and then 6 months later, we landed on the moon on Apollo 11. So it was a very, very interesting time, a very intense time, and you didn't have any shortage of things to do.
Yeah, I bet. I have no idea how accurate my reconstruction of that was earlier, but tell us a bit about that, just being in mission control on that first moon landing. What was going on, either in your mind or in the room around you?
Well, we had flown Apollo 7 in October of 1968. We'd had the tragedy of Apollo 1, the Apollo fire, in January of 1967, January 27th of 67, and it took a good while to recover from that. We lost the 3 astronauts on the launch pad, and we were flying in a pure oxygen environment in the spacecraft. And in a pure oxygen environment, just about anything burns. So we had unfortunately put a lot of flammable material in the spacecraft, and when a spark occurred, it ignited that flammable material, and we lost the 3 astronauts. So we had to really come up with redesigns of the spacecraft, and we had to do that very quickly if we were going to be successful and land by the end of the decade, and not have those 3 individuals give their lives in vain for what they were working toward that goal, as we all were. And so we had to develop a whole host of new materials, non-flammable materials that wouldn't burn in oxygen. And that just upped the pace considerably, because you had to find these materials, you had to do the testing and make sure they didn't burn, and then you had to put them into products in order to have them suitable in products that the astronauts could wear, they could use, and put them in the spacecraft. And so the fire happened in January of 67. We flew the first flight successfully in October of 68. So during that intervening time, we did major redesigns, and we developed new materials, and materials that are still being used today in applications in racing and other places where they have a need for non-flammable materials. So we flew Apollo 7 in October of 68. First time we had television from a spacecraft, and that was black and white television, not the television you can see today from space station, which is great television. But it was black and white, and it was pretty grainy and not very good, but it was spectacular to us on the ground and being able to see something in flight. So we flew that, and at that point we were having trouble with our lunar module. It was behind schedule. And so in August of 68, before we flew Apollo 7, the individual I worked for, George Lowe, the program manager, concluded there was no way we were going to make landing on the moon if we continued on the present schedule. We had to do something new and dramatic. And so he took a week's vacation. He worked about 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, but he took a week vacation and went up to upstate New York, and he came back and he told me that I think I have a way to do it. We'll come up with a program where we'll take the command module, the command and service module, which is without the lunar module, and we'll go fly around the moon and do Apollo 8 that way. And we'll prove everything out that we can get to the moon and get around the moon and get an orbit around the moon, and then that'll get us a chance to be able to make the lunar landing in 1969. So that was August, and he had to go sell that program to the leadership. And he went to talk to Sam Phillips, and he talked to Bob Gilruth, who ran the center, and Werner von Braun, and they all got together and met with Werner von Braun over in Huntsville, Alabama, and they all agreed that was really what we had to do. The Saturn V, which was the booster that would take Apollo 8 to the moon, had just flown that spring. And on that flight, the Saturn rocket was a major element in our system. That was, I think, really the first flight of the Saturn. On the second stage, we had 2 engines shut down and lost an engine on the third stage, and then the engine on the third stage wouldn't restart. We lost another engine on the second stage. And then part of the spacecraft LEM adapter came apart, which went around the area where the lunar module was. So we had to fix all those things and find out why those engines failed and get that done if we're going to fly Apollo 8 in December of 1968. And so we had the spring, from the spring of 68 till December to get all that done and get a vehicle ready to fly. So the next time we flew a Saturn V, we flew it to the moon on Apollo 8, and everything worked as advertised. So that flew, and that proved we could get to the moon and get around the moon. And some of you here were probably young enough to remember Apollo 8, and that was a very emotional time because that's the first time that we took individuals out of Earth orbit. And so that was a real challenge, and as you saw the photographs or the television pictures they showed looking back at the Earth, you could see the Earth for the first time from a long distance, and the pictures they brought back were spectacular. But we went into orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve of 1968, and they had the television camera focused on the moon, and so we were seeing pictures of the moon for the first time really close up. And as they did that, they read from the scriptures as we circled the moon. And that's probably one of the real emotional highs for everyone in the control center. It was, looking back on it, it's tough to trade off between Apollo 11 and Apollo 8 because that was really meaningful to us all. But we flew that in December, and then we flew in March. We flew a lunar module for the first time with the command and service module, and we flew that in Earth orbit. And we separated the lunar module away from the command and service module because when we flew a lunar mission, they would have to fly separately. So we flew 2 spacecraft in orbit for the first time. The crew had to train to fly both spacecraft, which is a real challenge. And they did that successfully, and they separated by about 500 miles and then re-rendezvoused and docked together. And that mission turned out to be successful. That was in March. And then in May, we took the lunar module and the command and service module and flew another mission to the moon just a little over 2 months later, where we actually went into orbit around the moon and descended with the lunar module right over the landing site that we would land on in July. So that mission, we had some problems on that mission that caused us to be concerned. We lost a fuel cell around the moon, and the lunar module had a control problem around the moon, but we were able to solve those problems, and in July, that was just 2 months later, we did Apollo 11, and Apollo 11, of course, was very successful, and we were able to get to the moon before the end of the decade. And had we not done Apollo 8 as we did, we probably would not have made it.
Right, right. I mean, the pressures on you must have been immense in a sense. On the one hand, you had to worry about astronaut safety and the success of the mission. On the other, it's a Cold War context. I imagine the political pressures must have been immense. Were there direct political pressures placed on NASA, or did you have a sense that you were kind of autonomous?
Well, I think we all felt that President Kennedy had given us a goal to land on the moon before the end of the decade, and we wanted to do that. Everyone was working toward that objective. There was people that were concerned about whether the Russians were going to go to the moon or whether they'd beat us to the moon and all. But I think the major element in everyone's mind was getting to the moon before the end of the decade, and that was really what we were working toward. And we were successful, and of course, everyone was pretty highly elated when that happened, and so we took really some time off. We didn't go back to the moon until November, so that was Apollo 12. And on Apollo 12, in the first missions, we really, the emphasis was on getting there and landing successfully and getting the astronauts out in their spacesuits and then get them back to Earth. So after we had done that, really, we were more concerned about the science that we wanted to do on the moon, because it was important also to do the science. It was important getting to the moon, but here you had an opportunity to really learn about the moon and its relationship to the Earth and how the Earth was formed. And so we tried to put more emphasis on the following missions on science. So Apollo 12, we wanted to be sure that we had a capability of landing at a specific point on the moon. And we had launched a surveyor spacecraft, an unmanned spacecraft, and it had landed successfully on the moon. So on Apollo 12, which we flew in November, we decided we would land right next to that surveyor spacecraft. And that would prove our guidance systems and our capabilities to do the navigation. And so we launched Apollo 12, and that got to be a very exciting mission because we launched into a cloudy sky. The spacecraft got hit by lightning as it was being launched, and we lost all our guidance on the spacecraft, and all the electrical power went out on the spacecraft. So we were really in a major problem, and fortunately we had a guidance system on the launch vehicle, and that worked and kept us on course. And our flight controllers in the control center were able to figure out what maybe had happened when the lightning hit and got the electrical system back on. And then we got the navigation system once we got in orbit. We got it working again, and then we had to decide whether it was safe to go ahead and launch for the moon. And so we spent about an hour going through soul searching and making sure that we felt the spacecraft was working okay and we could go to the moon, and then launch them to the moon. And once they're on that trajectory, they're going to the moon. And Apollo 12 turned out to be a very spectacular mission, by not only being hit by lightning, but of course we landed right next to the surveyor, and the astronauts, when they went out on their extravehicular activities, went over to the surveyor and cut off pieces of the spacecraft and brought those back to Earth. So it turned out to be a really successful mission. And so we were looking forward to Apollo 13 being a great mission, because each of the missions on Apollo, we selected different landing sites because we wanted to learn more about the moon. So we tried to pick landing sites that would give us unique information and also give us different kinds of samples to return back to Earth. So Apollo 13 was going to another landing site, but we did have another problem when we got on our trajectory to the moon. The astronauts had just finished a press conference with their families and the American public, and then that had just gone off the TV channels, and then we had a problem. We had an explosion that blew out part of the service module, and then we had to really figure out a way to get those astronauts who are going to the moon, figure out how to get them turned around and coming back to the Earth and bring them safely back to the Earth. And they've done a movie of that, of course, and how many of you have seen? Apollo 13 had a lot of anxious moments, and the astronauts had to go over to the lunar module to live because the command module systems were all down because of the explosion, and the only power we had left in the command module was battery power, so we needed that to return to Earth once we got the command module back into where it was re-entering the Earth. So they had to go to the lunar module. We had to get everything turned on in the lunar module, which wasn't designed to live in, which was designed to land on the moon, and they had to exist in the lunar module, and it was really a very challenging time because we had to conserve power, and the astronauts were able to perform and do what they had to do, and we were able to go all the way around the moon on what we call a free return trajectory, where you go out, you circle the moon, and then you come back to the Earth, and we were able to do course corrections with the lunar module engine. So we kept on the right course and got them back close to the Earth and separated the lunar module, and then the command module came in as it normally did, and we had enough electrical power in the command module to go ahead and perform the landing and land successfully in the ocean. And so that turned out well, even though it didn't look like it was going to be that kind of a flight once we had the explosion. So it took us again a while to figure out what caused that problem. And then the next mission we flew was Apollo 14 to a different landing site, and we returned different samples. And then on Apollo 15, in order to maximize the science return, we had designed a vehicle that they could actually drive on the moon, we called it a lunar rover, that was operated with electrical power, and that was attached to the side of the lunar module, and that would allow them to get further away from the lunar module, pick up more samples and in more locations. And so that was flown on Apollo 15, and the astronauts, when they landed, would pull a chain and it would lower the vehicle to the surface, and then they'd unfasten it from the vehicle, and they were able to drive it. And we had a television camera on the lunar rover, and so they would take the lunar rover to a specific site, and then they would aim the television camera antenna back to the Earth. And so they'd get out and work around the lunar rover, and we could follow them because we could command the television camera from the Earth, and we were able to get pictures of the astronauts as they performed their science experiments and gathered samples around the moon. And we flew that on Apollo 15, 16, and 17. And again, they all went to different landing sites, and it turned out to be a very successful program.
Yeah, I'm somewhat like Dylan Thomas, struck dumb by the immensity of these stories, George. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you had people like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells imagining the first men on the moon. Very soon it'll take an equal act of imagination to imagine the last person on the moon, and that there'll be a generation where no one will have actually stepped on the moon. And that just leads us to think about the legacy of the Apollo missions. You know, how do you think they'll be considered retrospectively as a series of Cold War postures, or perhaps no significant moments in 20th century history?
Well, I think they'll be considered as one of humankind's great achievements. There's no question about that. And if you look at that period of time in the United States, it was a very troubled time. We had a lot of race riots. We had the Vietnam War going on. We had a lot of unhappiness in the country and riots about the war. And so you look back on the 60s in the United States, and the only bright thing about the 60s was the Apollo program. And you know, the war was going on. It was costing the country a lot of money. We were losing a lot of lives. We did the racial tension in the country. But the bright thing and the people that everyone related to was we landed on the moon. And if you talk to those airmen that were shot down in Vietnam and were prisoners, they found out about landing on the moon, and that was, a source of great pride to them, that they were able to find that out, and nobody else had done that.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great legacy. We're going back to the moon. The Russians want to go to the moon. The Chinese want to go to the moon. And in the United States, we have people that want to go back to the moon. And probably we're going to do it differently, and that's a good thing. Because when we did the Apollo missions, it was just the United States as a country. We were competing against the Soviet Union. And today, the program has evolved where we're flying the International Space Station. And it's a program of many nations. We have 16 nations involved on the International Space Station. And the Russians are involved, the European community is involved, the Japanese are involved, and Canada is involved. We have a Canadian commander on the space station now, and that's a good thing. I think when we go back to the moon, we'll do it, I think, as an international community. We won't do it as a single country, and that's the right way to do it. And that's the way we ought to do the program. If you go back and read some of the words that John Kennedy spoke on January 25th of 1963, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York. And he said at that time, and this was before we really landed on the moon, he made an offer to the Russians to go to the moon with the Russians. And that gets lost in history, but John F. Kennedy had the vision then that the right thing was to do. He said, why should we be duplicating each other? Why don't we go together? And he made the offer to the Russians to go together. And the Russians, after a period of time, after a couple months, said they wanted to consider it. And then, of course, John Kennedy lost his life, and that went by the wayside. But he had the vision and saw that, and today we're flying in space the right way, I think, working together, and that's the right thing to do.
Right, yeah. Well, the Apollo missions come to an end, but then it's the space shuttle that takes over, and again, you're an absolutely
well, we had another couple missions in between the space shuttle.
Right.
We had the Skylab program, which is our first space station, and we flew that. We ended Apollo in December '72, and then in May of '73 we started flying Skylab, the first space station, and we had some major problems with that. It was launched on a Saturn V vehicle, and the launch loads were higher than predicted, and so the thermal shield on the Skylab, the space station, ripped off during the launch, and one of the solar arrays also ripped off, and the other was stuck and wouldn't deploy. So here we were with a space station in orbit and 3 astronauts ready to go up to it 2 days later, but the temperatures were too high for the astronauts to live in, and we had to figure out a way to save that space station and save it rather quickly, because we're going to lose it if we didn't. And so within a 10-day period, we figured out a way of doing that, coming up with a device much like an umbrella or a parasol, where you put a thermal shield instead of the fabric on an umbrella, and the astronauts would go up, dock with the space station. They'd go in, and there was a scientific airlock that was in the right location. They would take the umbrella, stick it out through the scientific airlock, deploy it, and the thermal shield would cover the outside and then cool it down. So that was our plan, and that's what we did, and it worked. And when they first went in there, the temperatures were very high, but they put that out, and it brought the temperatures right down. And so it was a livable temperature inside, but we didn't have enough electrical power because we lost one of the solar arrays. So the astronauts had to go out and get the other one, which was stuck in some wreckage, and get it deployed. And they went out on two occasions to get it cut loose, and we had never done anything like that before, but we were able to come up with a plan to do that, get that deployed, and then we got the electrical power, and then the astronauts were able to stay up in orbit for 28 days, and then we flew another mission of 59 days after that, and a subsequent mission of 89 days after that. Then, of course, the Russian space station program was coming along at the same time, and they had a very successful space station, and our longest time was 89 days on Skylab, but the Russians on their space station have a number of individuals that have flown for more than a year, and one individual that's flown almost for a year and a half. So we had that program, and that was in '73, and in '72 we started the space shuttle program. So we had that all going on, and then in 1975 we had Apollo-Soyuz, the first mission we flew with the Russians. So we were doing all those programs, and then suddenly working with the Russians for the first time to do a joint program docking together in space and proving a docking system that both the Russians could use and that we could use to rescue astronauts and cosmonauts in orbit. And so we had to come up with a design working with the Russians. We did do that, and we suddenly found ourselves working with Russians in Houston and Americans going to Russia, and that was a new experience for us. And a lot of learning both on the Russians' part and our part. A lot of that carried over later on to the International Space Station. But the Apollo-Soyuz mission was flown in '75 and was very successful, and then we were working on the space shuttle, so when Skylab ended and Apollo-Soyuz ended, we were trying to get the space shuttle ready to fly, and we had expectations to fly it in the 70s, but unfortunately it wasn't ready. We didn't fly it till '81.
Yeah, and I remember that vividly as a child. Well, tell us a little bit then about the highs and lows of the shuttle program as you had about Apollo. What are the things that stay in the mind? Well,
the space shuttle was a very unique vehicle. It was a reusable spacecraft and landed on a runway, but we had to learn a lot about the aerodynamics of coming back in at those speeds and flying in the atmosphere. So we had to do a lot of testing and get the confidence that we knew how to control it and fly it back through the atmosphere back in and do a landing. So we did a great deal of wind tunnel testing. We did a lot of testing of the thermal systems because we had a thermal system that was different than we'd used on a capsule. It was a system that was reusable, and so we did all that, and were able to come up and prove to ourselves that we could fly the space shuttle. On all our other spacecraft, we usually had flown an unmanned flight. And on the space shuttle, we decided that we would fly the first flight of the space shuttle manned. So there was no earlier flight to prove the systems. We flew the shuttle manned the first flight. So there was a lot of anxiety on that flight to make sure that it was going to work and work well. And there were a lot of concerns until we actually came back into the atmosphere and landed on a runway for the first time. And that mission was flown in April of '81, 20 years after Yuri Gagarin flew. And it was a very successful flight. And probably, if I look back on the highlights of the space shuttle program, that was one of the real highlights, getting the confidence we could do that. And John Young, the commander, I think you can see some videos that show John and I after he landed, and he's dancing for joy right around the shuttle because he's very happy he's back. But the shuttle again proved out to be a good vehicle. We flew it 23 more times after that, and then we had the Challenger accident, which it really in space flight, you have to do things the right way, and you have to pay attention to detail. And when you have a problem, the laws of physics are telling you got a problem and you need to solve it. Unfortunately, there were people involved in the process who thought that they could get by, and you can't get by in the spaceflight business. You have to be right every time. And so we lost a crew of 7 because we launched when we shouldn't have launched, and we lost the shuttle. And so that was a real setback for us. And we were able to continue the program and build another shuttle. And we flew 141 missions of the shuttle. We had another accident with the Columbia, again, for the same kind of reasons, because we had a problem on the previous flight that told people that you shouldn't fly until you solve that problem. And that wasn't the case, and we lost 7 people again. And it proves that, it's a hard way to learn a lesson. You don't want to learn it that way. You got to pay attention to detail. You have to do things right constantly, and there's no margin for error when you're flying humans, and that was unfortunate. But the space shuttle, I think, is a good vehicle. It turned out that the vehicle could fly many more times than we flew it. The systems that really caused the problem were new on every flight, so it wasn't like we were having an age problem. The problems that we had that caused the problem were the solid rockets and the external tank that caused our problems. So those were brand new on every flight. The orbiter of the vehicle itself was an outstanding spacecraft, could do all kinds of things. It went up and you could go repair satellites, which we did. We could pick up satellites in orbit and return them to Earth, which we did, and they got relaunched. It allowed us to take up and assemble the space station in orbit, all the modules on the space station, and do extravehicular activities with the astronauts in spacesuits doing the assembly of the space station in orbit. You couldn't do that with any other vehicle, and there's no vehicle on a drawing board anywhere that will have the capabilities of the space shuttle. It was a very unique and a very special vehicle, so it took us a long time to learn all the issues and problems with flying it, but when we stopped flying it, the whole shuttle team was probably at the top of their game. We had a group of people in Florida that really understood how to test and check out the vehicle. We had a group that knew how to fly it and operate it and control it in space, and we had flight crews that were well trained and understood it, and then suddenly you brought it to an end, which was not a good thing.
No, right, so that was George W. Bush's administration that brought it to an end, was it?
Well, they announced in 2004 that they were going to stop flying it after the space station was assembled, and so the space station was finally assembled in 2011, and that's when they stopped flying it. President Obama could have changed that, but he chose not to.
Time's flying by, George. I want to ask you a bit about your Welsh background. Before doing that, you've evoked international cooperation really as the model for future space exploration. What else? What happens next? What are the major phases that we're likely to see in the next few
Well,
decades?
right now the United States is very dependent on Russia, and they've been a very good partner for us. Our astronauts, if we want to fly an American in space, the road for him to fly to space is through Moscow and Star City and Baikonur. So I think we're going to be very dependent on the Russians in the future. There are some spacecraft being developed by private contractors that are supported by the government. Those have had some degree of success in doing unmanned missions. I think both China has had made overtures to us to be a part of the International Space Station, and the U.S. chose not to bring them in. Russia and Canada and Europe, I think, would like to bring them in. The Chinese are developing a space station. They have another mission being planned. They'll probably fly in June up to their space station. So you're going to see continued activity in space. The Russians certainly have an ambitious program. President Putin just announced in April, on the anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's flight, he was going to put $50 billion in between 2013 and 2021 into the Russian program. And I think in our country, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come up with a plan and approach to work together again to go back to the moon and Mars. But right at the moment, the outlook is not bright.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you something about the Welsh dimension then in the last phase of our conversation. In the piece on the Western Mail, you actually mentioned growing up in Seattle, and there was to some extent a Welsh American community there.
Yes.
Seattle isn't generally considered a major centre for Welsh American emigration, so perhaps you could tell us a bit about that and then trace us back via your mother to Larne and tell us a bit about it.
Well, my mother was born in Larne, and she left Larne and worked in Carmarthen when she was a young girl, and then went to work in London. And my father was born in London, and he had immigrated to Canada. And so when World War I came along, he joined the Canadian Army and came over to fight in France with the Canadian Army. He was wounded in France and came back to London to recuperate, and met my mother then. My mother was a conductor on a double-decker bus in London then, and so they met, and my oldest brother was born in Wales, and they had gotten married, and then after the war they came to Canada and lived in Canada for a period of time, and then came down to the United States. And so myself and my sister and my two other brothers were born in Seattle, but my father and mother had a lot of friends, Welsh and Scotch and Irish and English friends in Seattle, and there's quite a community there, and then also in Canada, in Vancouver and British Columbia. And so my mother and father had purchased a home in a place called White Rock right on the ocean in British Columbia. So when I was growing up, my sister and I and my mother would go up and spend the whole summer in Canada. And of course, we were very, very close to our Welsh and Scottish and English friends up there. And then when the King and Queen came over to visit Vancouver, I can remember my family taking my sister and I up to see the King and Queen in Vancouver. So we had a close association with the UK, and then my mother was one of 5 sisters, so the other 4 stayed in Wales. She was the only one that left, and so we had a lot of letters and friends, a lot of communications going back and forth, and friends visiting that knew my mother's and her sisters, and so we managed to stay close to my mother's family and stay close to our relatives over here. And so Wales has had always a great meaning and significance for me. I think the values my mother lived growing up here in Wales carried over to me and my sister and my brothers, and had great meaning in my life. And I think Wales, in my view, has been a big part of my life ever since I came on this earth, and I feel very much at home in Wales.
Well, we're honoured to have you. Mae di bod yn rhywbeth gyfweld chi. George, it's been an honour to interview you tonight. I think we managed to traverse around the stars and return to Wales, and I'll certainly remember this evening for a long time. I'd now like to invite Swansea University's Chancellor, Rodri Morgan, to close the evening with a vote of thanks. Diolch i chi gyd am ddod. Does dim angen I fi gyflwyno cyn brif weinidog Cymru, rwy'n siŵr. Felly, diolch yn fawr I George. Thank you very much, George. Thank you.
We've talked a lot about pictures of Wales from space, and I would like to, Rodri, I'd like to present this picture of Wales from space that was taken, and I think you can find Wales there.
Upside down, yeah, I can see it, yes, very good. Thank you, George. Thank you. I'm sure that I am speaking on behalf of all of us in giving an incredibly warm thank you to a passionate Welsh American space hero in George Abbey, whose mother came from Larne, previously famous, mostly because it is the birthplace of Dylan Thomas, whose centenary of his birth we will be all celebrating next year. But now we have a second reason for admiring that wonderful, slightly quirky little village in South Carmarthenshire, which not only produced Dylan Thomas then, but also George Abbey's mother. In a way, that span of time of 5.5 decades since the first Sputnik that George has covered, and him saying that on a journey from Seattle through Montana back to Texas and getting out of his car and seeing and actually hearing the beep, beep, beep of Sputnik going overhead in the late 50s, and then the full run of the American space program, it's almost like the span of my life as well, of, which decade did Sputnik happen in, which decade did Kennedy make his pledge, and then the completion of that pledge in the late 60s, and then the other Apollo and Saturn programs and so forth. And what occurred to me was this, that if you're my age, as a sort of war baby, growing up with this, and then middle age with this, and in old age, the eventual abandonment of the separate US program. And George has not just seen it all, I've seen it all, but he actually helped to do it all. And that's what's been so wonderful. Because it brought back memories for me. I can remember when Sputnik first flew. Of course, it was a terrible shock to America, which automatically assumed that it had technical leadership, not just in weaponry, but also in civil space programs. And when they found they didn't, because suddenly Sputnik was up there, of course, it was only a dozen years after the end of World War II, and much of it, the American space program and the Russian space program, had been based on rocket experts who had been captured from the Germans, who had been developing the V1s and the V2s that were supposed to obliterate London in the final months of World War II. And indeed, I seem to remember Bob Hope wisecracking when Sputnik went up and said, "Don't worry, it just means that their Germans are cleverer than our Germans." And but then George being right at the heart of the space program, it did occur to me, I remember as well, when Neil Armstrong was asked at the innumerable gatherings and speeches that he was asked to make, and maybe even occasions like this with somebody putting questions to him in front of an audience like this. And one of the questions to Neil Armstrong after he had come back in 1969, so this may have been in 1970 or 71, well, Neil Armstrong, what did you actually think when you were becoming the first man to land on the moon? Did you think of, that you would go down in history as, a really major figure in all the history books, alongside the major historical figures that we all relate to? What was actually in your mind? It was none of that, he said. It was just the realization that my chances of getting back to Earth and seeing my wife and family again depended on more than 25,000 separate NASA contracts, all of which had been awarded to the lowest possible bidder. And actually, I spoke to George about this last night, and he said, well, that is absolutely true. He said, and I awarded most of those contracts. So it's been an enormous privilege for us to have heard George take that full span from the Russian challenge to the American response to the high point, but then also to see that in the end, this sort of astonishing vision that instead of being driven by Cold War competition and by the relationship between the military program and the civilian program, in the end, what you've now got is a cooperative arrangement between what isn't the USSR anymore, now it's just Russia, although I think the space station is probably not in Russia, but in one of the stands, I can't remember which one, down in Central Asia, and the Americans, and it's a joint cooperative arrangement, and soon there may be other countries like China and involved as well. And so George has seen all that even, to these joint programmes of astronauts and cosmonauts, as we were all taught to read the USSR as cosmonauts, the Americans as astronauts. Now you can wipe out that distinction because they'll be going up on a Russian rocket and space station, but they'll be doing, huge experiments of value to mankind on a joint basis. And what a change that is from the way this was driven by intense Cold War competition for technological leadership at the height of the Cold War. No more Cold War now, lots of different kinds of wars, no more Cold War, and a joint space program. What an amazing transformation. George has seen it all, and he has helped to give us that picture of how it all happened from the inside as a proud and passionate Welsh American. It's been a real privilege to be with you here tonight. Diolch yn fawr am eich cyfraniad. Ni ni wedi mwynhau yn enfawr beth ydych chi wedi gweud wrthon ni yn ateb cwestiynau Daniel. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much.
You want to answer any questions? Or?
No, we'll